Okay, so this week's Parsha is Parshat Vayishlach. And we're talking this week about, it's called Vayishlach, and he sent. We're now at the other end of the whole Lavan story as last week. Last week we started off Vayetze Yaakov in Beersheba. Yaakov departed, he left from where he was living. He went to Haran to escape Esav, to save his life. He was going to live in Haran, which was not the prettiest of places, certainly spiritually, but he was going there anyways. He spent his time there, and now, many years later, we are... No, that's the wrong one, sorry, this one here. That's way old. This should all be current here, Hebrew and English. So now this week we're at Vayishlach, which is when Yaakov's on the way back. And Vayishlach, Yaakov sent messengers ahead to try to warm things up and do some damage control with Esav. So that's where we're at now. Now, in this week's Parsha, we have something interesting that happens. Yaakov gets a name, I guess we could call it an upgrade. He gets a name change. And if we look at what it says in the Pasuk, it says, V'lo yikare shimcha od Yaakov ki im Yisroel yiyeh shemecha. Your name, you will no longer be called by the name Yaakov, rather you will be called by the name Yisroel. We are called Bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people, because we are the sons of Yisrael, of Israel, i.e. Yaakov. So that's where the name Bnei Yisrael comes from. We are the children of Yaakov, whose name was changed to Yisrael. We are also Bnei Avram and Bnei Yitzchak. Yaakov is the last of, as we mentioned over the last couple of weeks, the last of the universal patriarchs of the entire Jewish people. So Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were patriarchs of the entire Jewish people. Then Yaakov's sons started to branch out, and none of his sons is a patriarch or a progenitor of the entire Jewish people, each one of one tribe. So Yaakov is the last of the universal patriarchs of the entire Jewish people, so we are called Bnei Yisrael, which would be equivalent of saying Bnei Yaakov. And it's because in this week's Parsha, he was told that his name would change from Yaakov to Yisrael. Now what's interesting is we have something similar. We have a similar phenomenon that happened in the past about Avram. Avram was also told, you will no longer be called Avram. His name originally was Avram Aleph Ves Resh Mem, Avram. And he was told, you will no longer be called Avram, rather you will be called Avraham, with a Hey, Aleph Ves Resh Hey Mem. What's interesting is there's a big difference between these two phenomena, because with Avram, it actually says in the Gemara, do we have the quote here? Right, yes, okay. So the Gemara says, Kol hakor la'Avraham Avram, anyone who calls Avraham Avram, over al hatzivui is transgressing the directive of the Torah which says, V'lo yikare od shimcha Avram, your name will no longer be called Avram. So the Torah says your name will not be called Avram, it will be called Avraham, which means that if we refer to him as Avram, we are transgressing that directive of the Torah which says your name will not be called Avram. Now we have the same words, almost the identical words about Yaakov. It says, V'lo yikare shimcha od Yaakov ki im Yisrael, your name will no longer be called Yaakov, but we do call him Yaakov. So why is it that once we were told not to call Avram anymore, but Avraham, it's prohibited to call him Avram, but after the Pasuk says to Yaakov, your name will no longer be Yaakov, it will be Yisrael, we are allowed to still refer to him as Yaakov. So the Gemara, coming from a halachic perspective, explains that if you look throughout the Torah, from when Avram was told that his name was no longer be Avram, he would be Avraham, from that point on, he was no longer referred to in the Torah as Avram. He was only referred to as Avraham. If you look through the Torah as it continues after this event, Yaakov is still referred to as Yaakov. So the Torah itself, for whatever reason, the Torah itself is letting us know that for whatever reason, despite the fact that it said you will no longer be called Yaakov, but you will be called Yisrael, it doesn't literally mean you will actually not be called Yaakov and you're not allowed to be referred to as Yaakov, because the Torah itself continues to call him Yaakov. So that obviously lets us know that we are allowed to call him Yaakov, because his name, Yaakov, didn't cease to be in effect. He just got an additional name. as opposed to Avraham, whose name Avram ceased to be in effect from that point on, which is why we're not allowed to call him Avram anymore. Now, as we usually do in this class, we're going to go a little deeper and discuss the why. Because we've already discussed the why now on a technical level. We now understand why it is that we're allowed to call Yaakov Yaakov, even though we're not allowed to call Avraham Avram. We understand that from a halachic perspective. Or the truth is, we don't even understand necessarily why. We understand how we know that that's the case. The Gemara explains that because the Torah continues to call Yaakov Yaakov, that shows us that we're allowed to call him Yaakov. But why is it that when Avraham's name changed from Avram to Avraham, we ceased to be allowed to use the name Avram? But when Yaakov's name changed from Yaakov to Yisroel, we're allowed to continue calling him both Yaakov and Yisroel. To understand the why, we're going to have to look at the meaning of these names. Once we understand what each of these names represent, and really the text here actually only focuses on Yaakov versus Yisroel, but I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about Avram versus Avraham as well, because we didn't discuss it in the past when we were discussing the story of Avraham, and I think it's a nice thing to... It's nice to know, and it'll contribute to this discussion somewhat as well. Because it kind of does explain why we don't call him Avram anymore, we call him Avraham. Now, Abraham's name changed from Avram to Avraham in connection to his bris. When he had the bris, his name was changed from Avram to Avraham. Now, what's interesting is that he was told, your name will no longer be Avram, your name will be Avraham. Why? Ki av hamoin goyim nasaticha. Hashem says, I have made you a father of all the nations, of the multitude of nations. So the Hey in Avraham stands for Hamon, which means the multitude, all the nations. You're no longer just a father for your own family, your own tribe. You are now a father for everyone. A universal patriarch of sorts. So the question becomes, how does that make sense? We're talking about, this happened in relation to Avram's bris. Avram formed a covenant with Hashem. Avram took his unique and special relationship with Hashem deeper by entering into this covenant of bris milah, this covenant that's associated with circumcision. And now that he's entering in this covenant and deepening his relationship with Hashem, now all of a sudden he's a father to everybody, as opposed to just his tribe and his family of people who are being circumcised and who are entering into this covenant together with him. How does that add up? It seems to be going in the opposite direction. You would think. He's entering into a covenant. He's bringing his family into his covenant. This should further solidify the unique position that he has as father of his family, his household, his tribe, and the special relationship that they have with God through this covenant. Why is it that now he's entering into this covenant and bringing his family into the covenant? All of a sudden now he's the father of everybody, universal patriarch of all the nations. And the answer is in the name. Avram. Now, I'm not going to get into it too much into the details from a Kabbalistic perspective because we'd have to talk about it all week. But Av means father, and Kabbalistically, Av refers to what's called Chachma, to this sphera, this attribute of divine. Chachma is generally translated as wisdom in the context of the spheres. I don't love the word wisdom as a translation. Probably conception is a better technical translation. I don't want to get too carried away into that either. But Chachma, anyway, it's a divine attribute of Chachma, of wisdom, conception, whatever we want to call it. It's a divine, so to speak, intellectual attribute. And Ram, in Hebrew, means elevated, lofty. Romamus means elevation, elevatedness. So Avram, which is what his name was, means this high, this lofty, elevated, ethereal, divine attribute of wisdom, of conception, whatever we're going to call it. And this is what Avram represented and what he embodied at that point up until his circumcision, which is clearly something that's incredibly powerful, incredibly ethereal and spiritual and holy, etc., etc. But it's wrong. It's elevated. God didn't put people on the planet to just be elevated, to be up there, to live in an ethereal reality. God put us here to engage the world, to bring Him, to bring God, to bring the Creator into the world, so that the Creator should become a part of the world, not just the Creator of the world, but a part of the fabric of the world as well. And that's something that we do through our actions. Now that Avram became Avraham, now that Avraham had his circumcision, entered this covenant, he became a lot more spiritually powerful, which allowed him to not just be this lofty spiritual entity, but to take all of that spiritual power that he had, and to bring it into the world and to use it to engage the world, engage the people in the world, to bring godliness into the world around him, into the people around him. And that's why when he entered this covenant, he went beyond just needing to remain spiritually aloof and ethereal. He became capable of bringing that down into the world and sharing it with people, which is why he now became the universal patriarch, Av Hamon Goyim. So when he had the circumcision, when he entered this covenant, he became more spiritually effective, but more spiritually effective doesn't necessarily mean higher up and more ethereal, right? Because as long as spirituality needs to remain ethereal, that's a limitation. If you say that this spirituality is capable of being just as spiritually powerful and lofty, but to take that same spirituality and to bring it somewhere else that is naturally not predisposed to being receptive to it, and you can bring it there and make that place be receptive and allow the two to interact, that takes a lot more power. That takes a much more highly advanced spiritual state. And that's what Avram achieved when he had his circumcision. That's why his name changed from Avram, lofty and ethereal, to Avraham, Av Hamon Goyim. He now became the universal patriarch. He became able to influence and share this godliness with everybody. Now we can understand from this perspective why the Torah would not want us to be calling him Avram. Because Avram had its time and place, but once he changed to Avraham, once he became able and this mission was activated, God said, now it's time for you to go out in the world and become Avraham, Av Hamon Goyim, to become the universal patriarch, to bring this godliness and share it with the world, share it with everybody. To just sit up and remain somewhere lofty and detached and ethereal would be defeating the purpose. God said, now I want you to engage. It's time to enter the active phase of this process. It's time to start realizing the purpose of creation, which is to bring God and godliness into the entire world and to share it with everybody. Every one of us has our own ability to have our own unique relationship with God. It's not the same, but each of us is able to share what we have as much as possible with all the people around us. To whatever extent we can, we share it individually with each person in the way that suits them best. That's not necessarily always such a realistic option for everybody, so we share as much as we can, and everybody will take and will interact in their own way. We're all individual and we all have our own relationship, but we can share what we have with everybody and everybody else will work it out. I don't need to say that person's different to me, they have a different relationship. I'm not going to share what I know of God and what I know of godliness and spirituality. Because that would be Avram. I'm just sitting up there lofty by myself. And the Torah says, your name is no longer Avram. It's Avraham. And if someone refers to you as Avram, that is a transgression. It's prohibited to refer to Avraham as Avram because that's not the point. Once we've entered the active phase and God said it's time to start actually doing this, it's prohibited to just be Avram. We have to be Av Hamon Goyim. We have to be engaging the world and sharing God and godliness with the people around us.
Doesn't it say that Hashem wanted to be in the Tachtonim?
Of course. It says in the Medrash Tanchuma that that's the reason the world was created, and that's exactly the point. That's right. The Tanya quotes it from the Medrash Tanchuma.
So that's the whole point.
100%. That's exactly why it says you're not allowed to call him Avram anymore, Avraham, because this is the point. So up until that point, everything has a time and place. Up until that point, it was the Avram phase. But now, once we enter Avraham, the active phase of sharing that with everybody, we're not allowed to just choose not to be involved in that, because that's what we're here to do. And the Torah says, and the Gemara says, it's prohibition to refer to him as Avram.
But how can we say that because we always adjust the message based on who it is, or we decide what to say and what not to say, because it's important to understand that people will understand at their level. So is it not being Avraham if we...
No, being Avram is saying, I'm just going to sit and learn and study and meditate and not engage with anybody.
So for my selfish reasons, not for their benefit.
Avram means keeping it to myself, just going up that way, up to Rom, and ignoring the Hamon Goyim. There are different approaches of engaging with Hamon Goyim, and just like the people around us are unique, we're also unique. And the way that I engage with people is going to be different to the way you engage with people, because we're different. That's fine, as long as we're engaging.
Just like our own kids. They wanted to
100%. That's
and
yes,
they died.
exactly.
You're not allowed to.
That's right. So this is why Avram became a prohibited reference to Avraham. We're only allowed to refer to him as Avraham. The question now is, what do the names Yaakov and Yisroel represent? And when we understand what Yaakov and Yisroel represent, it's assumed, and I'm going to clarify and let you know that the assumption is correct, that we will understand how and why both of these names, or the messages that these names represent, are both applicable to us. And that's why, even though Hashem changed Yaakov's name to Yisroel, it didn't become prohibited to refer to him as Yaakov, because Yaakov is still part of the game too. We now have Yaakov and Yisroel, and each has its time and place, but they're both still in the game. As opposed to Avram is not part of the game anymore. Now it's the Avraham phase, it's engaging phase, it's Avhamon Goyim phase. So what do Yaakov and Yisroel represent? If we look in this week's Parsha, Rashi.
Well, Yaakov is still the son of Avraham. That's why he was part of it still, right?
Yeah, 100%, of course.
Yeah, like you could say this is wrong. You can't call him anymore Yaakov because he's the son of Avraham, and Avraham is already in the covenant. Everybody after him was...
Well, I mean, Hashem could have said that, Hashem could still have said, I'm changing your name now to Yisroel and you can't be called Yaakov anymore. He could have. He just didn't.
Right.
So the question is, what does it represent? So in terms of what you're saying, I see where you're coming from, because what you're saying is, now that Avram entered the covenant, the pre-covenant history was supposed to be history and not current. Right. We don't want to go back to that name. Right. As opposed to Yaakov and Yisroel are both post-covenant. Right. But still, Hashem may have said that within the context of Yaakov's life, Yaakov was phase 1. Phase 1 is now obsolete. We're now entering phase 2, which is Yisroel.
He could have,
but he
maybe
didn't.
Why he didn't is because he's part of the covenant.
Perhaps. The question is, what specifically do these two names represent to us in our day-to-day life today?
Okay, I see.
What you're saying is true, and it's a very valid explanation. But what I want to do is look at what these names mean and represent to us in our lives today, here, and then we'll understand how and why they both apply.
Okay.
Rabbi, Avram, even when he was Avram, he shared godliness. Even when he was Avram and he wasn't Avram.
He did.
But he was not told to.
The ability to integrate it into the world changed to a whole different level after he had the bris. So he did engage, because he engaged as a person before, but the question is, to what extent was he capable of actually taking that godliness and getting it to actually penetrate the world and integrate into it? And this is not something that we're necessarily going to be receptive to. So it's a good question, because he did, like you said, he was always engaging with people and sharing godliness way before this happened. But the question is, to what extent was he able to get that godliness to actually integrate with the world and become a part of it?
And he wasn't told by God to do that. Before. He was not told by
He was
God
doing
to
it
do
for the most part of his own
He was
initiative.
to whoever he wanted to. Now it was a responsibility.
Right, which is why
After he had his bris
No,
milah?
before he was
Yeah.
told.
which is why the story of Avraham starts in Lech Lecha. Even though a lot of the stories we know about Avram from Medrash happened before that, the Torah in the Psukim doesn't tell us about it because that was his own initiative.
But they're talking about what Abraham did, not that he was told by God
Correct.
to do that.
Correct.
But in Lech Lecha, he still was Avram.
Correct.
But
So he was still following God's directives, which is the number one lesson to us, is to be involved and to follow God's directives. Right? So that's why in the written Torah, the story of Avraham starts at Lech Lecha, not before, because that was the first point of contact when God gave him an explicit directive. And that's the main lesson for us. That's why in the written Torah, that's where the story starts, even though the Midrashim tell us about all these stories that happened before. And from that point on, he was doing, and like you said, and even before, the reason he got thrown in the fire, for example, was because he was sharing godliness. He was sharing the message of monotheism and one God, etc., which is why all of these stories happen in the first place, but of his own initiative.
I'm very anxious to hear what you have to say about why Yaakov was allowed to use the two names. Could we go back to that?
Yeah, we're definitely going there because that's what the bulk of the class is. So that's we're going to get there. So yeah, so he definitely was doing these things before, but he didn't have the power to actually bring not just the message of God, but the actual godliness and the spirituality, the spirit, into the fabric of the world to the same extent as he was able to after. So he was still a leader and a mentor and an influencer would be the current term, but he wasn't having the same actual, physical effect or spiritual effect, but in terms of the technical effect of actually making something happen to the world, that didn't happen before nearly as much as it was able to happen after. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay.
How come the Sikha is from Yud Shvat? Isn't it supposed to be kind of the same?
It's a good question. I don't know. I didn't even look. I didn't notice that. It's because towards the end it gets into, perhaps it talks about some things that the Friedrich Rebbe said about it. I'm not sure if that's the reason. I would have to look and pay attention and try to figure it out. And I didn't even notice that. So good question. Okay. So now Yaakov versus Yisroel. Right, which is which is the main meat and potatoes of what we're here to discuss, or tofu and potatoes if you're vegetarian. Sorry if I offended anyone by saying meat. Okay, so what does Yaakov represent? What does Yisroel represent? When Yaakov is fighting with the angel, we have this story where Yaakov is wrestling with Esav's angel. Esav's angel says to him, your name will no longer be called Yaakov but Yisroel. He's notifying him that God is going to change his name. And there Rashi explains the difference, the etymological difference, I guess we could say, kind of, between Yaakov and Yisroel. Yaakov, the word Yaakov comes from the word Akev, which means heel, which is why he was called that. It's also related to the Hebrew word for deceit. Yeah. So Yaakov obtained these blessings that he got from Yitzchak, from his father, technically speaking, on the surface level, by means of deceit. He tricked Yitzchak into giving him the blessings when Yitzchak apparently intended to give them to Esav. So he scammed his way into these blessings. So he was called, that was one of the things that was represented by the name Yaakov, that he scammed his way into these blessings. And the angel's telling him, your name is going to be changed from Yaakov, which represents a deceitful acquisition of these blessings, to Yisroel. Among there are a number of different things that the name Yisroel represents and messages that it carries. One of them is Sar. Sar means a minister. It means a noble person. Sar Kel. Yud Sar Kel. Yisroel. I'll write it out on the board if we have a marker. The name Yisroel. Can I erase this?
Yes.
Yeah. Whoops. Okay, so we have the name. You'll have to excuse my handwriting, which is atrocious. We have the Yud. Does this work or is it dry? Works. Yud,
El.
Sar, Kel.
El. Sar El.
Yes, we just don't say that because it's Hashem's name, so I'm saying Kel. Same way we say Elohim instead of with a hey. So Sar is a noble person, a prince of God. So what? Oh, you can't see it. All the people who are watching it on camera, but anyway. So, and this was the message that the angel of Esav was telling him. He's saying, "You overcame me today," because, and remember that Yaakov didn't steal these blessings. Yaakov had purchased the right to these blessings from Esav for a pot of soup.
That's right.
Right? Esav sold it to Yaakov. So Yaakov scammed Yitzchak into it because Yaakov didn't want to have to tell his father, by the way, you know your son Esav, who you think is a big hotshot, he actually sold his birthright to me for food because he was hungry. FYI. He didn't want to tell him that, so he scammed his way into it instead, even though he actually deserved it. And on this occasion, Esav's angel, Esav's spiritual representative, said, "Today I acknowledge that you did not scam your way into these blessings. It's not Yaakov, it's not deceit, it's Sar, which means noble, a noble person. You got them in a way of sarara, in a way you achieved them nobly, by means of noble form of acquisition. You acquired these honorably. Honorably is probably a better word. So Esav's angel on this occasion was acknowledging that you achieved these honorably in a way that was straightforward and fair and legit. So one of the things that these two names represent, the contrast, is Yaakov represents deceit. Yisroel represents doing something in a way that's legit and straight. So now the question is, if we're saying that even though Yaakov's name was changed from Yaakov to Yisroel, even though he was now told, by the way, your name no longer represents this deceitful way of doing things, but a straight up legit way of doing things, don't worry, you can still go by the name Yaakov. You can still scam your way into things if you need to. Right? The question is, what does that mean? What's the message to us? What are these scams? What's this deceit that the Torah is giving us permission to do by allowing us to continue to refer to him as Yaakov? So whereas by Avraham, the message of Avram became obsolete and we are now only allowed to refer to him as Avraham, the message of Yaakov remains valid together with, concurrently with the message of Yisroel. So clearly there are two different approaches which are valid and relevant in our lives today. One is some sort of form of deceit, and one is a contrasting approach of doing things in a way that's straight up and legit. Does anyone want to have a guess at the deceit that Yaakov's name is allowing us to carry on with?
When was the question? Sorry.
So we're saying that Yaakov represents deceit. Yisroel represents doing things in a way that's straight up and legit. Now the Torah allows us to continue calling him Yaakov because clearly, and the fact that it does so tells us, by the way, the message of Yaakov is still intact. It's still in place, and this approach of deceit still is valid. The question is, what is that deceit that's valid that we're allowed to do?
There are two ways to do your work, to do your job in this world, and one level is the level of Yaakov, and one level is the
Correct. What's the Yaakov? What's the deceit? Who are we deceiving?
You.
No peeking. I can do that myself.
So it came out
You're being
of
Yaakov. She's going the way of Yaakov.
So it came out of a very good intention. You know, the kavanah here of Yaakov, even though he deceived, first of all, he knew that the Bechorah was his, and the kavanah was with the brachot to do good.
Correct. But the question is to us, what's the deceit that we're allowed, or that the Torah is encouraging us to do today? It's saying, by the way, Yaakov is still good.
Of the Yetzer.
What's the
So we, L'Shem Shamayim, we can do that.
Correct, but we're allowed to do what? Am I allowed to engage in fraud because I'm doing it for the right intent? Of course
You
not.
can't do fraud for Shamayim,
Correct.
but you can-
Well, I could have a good intent when I commit fraud. I'm just not allowed to, not according to the Torah, not according to the law.
How can you do fraud for doing the Torah?
You can't. That's the point.
That's the point.
So the question is, what is this fraud, this deceit that we are allowed to do? What is it? What's it referring to?
For ourselves.
But the Yetzer
In what
Hara,
way?
Think until you make it with anything.
Okay, you know what? You know what? I want to say that although that's not the direction that this text is going in,
Israel is like
I think it's a good point, and it's important to keep in mind.
What did it
Kavashet Yetzer Hara.
That's the right direction.
I mean, like, for example, we learn that you're supposed to, even if you're not holding a place, you're supposed to behave as if you are, and you're supposed to do it, and you'll come to do it for the right reason. So maybe,
Right.
like, you know, to
Fake it till you make it.
yeah, so not to like be so honest about where you are, because then you can sit there.
Well, I would, just because I'm very picky about words, I would just tweak what you said, and rather than saying don't be so honest, don't be so particular about not allowing yourself to do something that's out of line where you honestly know that you're holding. Like, even if I'm not that great, it doesn't mean that I shouldn't try to do great things, right? Which is a different form of saying the same thing. Fake it till you make it. So yes, I'm not so great, but you know what? I'm going to behave like I am because I'm going to do the right things. And I'm going to try to exemplify the absolute best level of behavior, even though I'm not the best level of person. Right? And I'm glad that you both brought that up, because even though that's not the direction this is going in, it's an important thing to be aware of. And I think that I'm glad that we're mentioning and bringing it up. So, you know, it's important not to deceive ourselves in terms of our actual judgment, because then we can end up way off in all kinds of directions. We should be accurately self-aware, but at the same time, we can dray things a little, we can spin things a little, and behave in a way that's beyond where we're actually at.
Didn't Yaakov said to his mother, "Ani metatea," so that he was aware of again. So that's the awareness that he was deceiving. He was aware that he was deceiving.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah, he was.
And he goes from that, like he said, I can do a little bit out of the way in order to the kavanah amitit, which is my, within my covenant, within what God wants.
Yeah. The question is, what does this mean to us today? What's this deceit that we're engaging in today? And, well, first, what does deceit mean? What is deceit? What is fraud? What is a scam? All of these things, which are, I guess, to an extent synonymous, mean when we do something and our actions do not, or the actions that we are presenting do not align with our intent. I have something in mind and I behave like I have something else in mind. So my behavior implies one intent, but my actual intent is different. That's being deceptive. So the question is, in what specific scenario, and this is important because I am not, God forbid, saying that deceit and fraud and scams are okay. I'm saying that a very specific form of what we will describe as being a form of deceit, as will be described now going forward, is not only okay but recommended. So there's something there's an example that we can enact in our lives today where our actual intent doesn't align with what would likely be our perceived intent. And just to address this very, very generally, it's engaging in the world on a day-to-day basis. It's going to, even if someone is going into business with the objective of making tremendous amounts of money. They're not going on business to try to do miftzom. They're not going on business to try to influence people to become more spiritually in tune. They're going into business to make a lot of money. If this person is a person who is Torah observant, and particularly if they're Torah observant not just technically in their behavior, but in their mental and spiritual state, in their emotional state, and in their perspective, then their objective in going to work to make a lot of money, the objective behind the money is going to be different than someone who just wants to have money for whatever reason, whether it's just to have things that please them in the moment, whether it's for vanity, whether it's for whatever it is. And there are all kinds of positive ways that money can be used. Very simply, it can be used for charity. It can be used for spent on good things. And the Rebbe actually, interestingly, in discussions of this, talks about ways that can be used a little more subtly. Because the nature of humanity is that, I think it's fair to say we all are to some extent vain. And we're vain in different ways, but we all have our vanity. And there are some people who, part of their vanity is that because they are so enamored by wealth and wealth is so important to them. And, I've had the experience of observing this very directly myself. There are people, to a very extreme degree, there are people who almost literally won't even hear your voice if you don't have a net worth of at least $200 million. You can be sitting at the table and talking to them, and they don't even hear your voice. As soon as the guy at the table who's worth $500 million pipes up, all of a sudden their antennas go up and they hear what they have to say. They might just be talking about the sport. And I may have a better idea of how the games on this weekend are going to line up and who's going to win and who's going to lose. But because I don't have that fiscal net worth, he's not even going to hear my voice. But he'll hear the voice of that guy who has no idea about sport because he's worth $500 million. That's just one example. Now, if I have the intent to make the world a better place, a more godly place, a more divine place, and I know that when I am worth $500 million, there are people who will listen to me and take what I have to say seriously, and they won't take what anybody else has to say seriously. They're not going to take what any rabbi has to say seriously. They're not going to take what any shliach has to say seriously, but they're going to take what I have to say seriously. That empowers me to influence and to bring godliness to places that other people can't. Now, I'm not saying that it is necessarily a good idea to make your life objective to achieve a financial net worth of $500 million so you will be able to affect those people. I would say that for most people it's a bit of a long shot because first of all you have to get there, second of all you have to meet those people. I'm not saying it's necessarily a right forefront objective for most people's life goal, but it's a more subtle way that money can be used for good things. And it's just one of many, many examples. When you're on that when you have that financial status, you're circulating generally in a different tier of society and you're encountering people that other people aren't encountering, which allows you to, and it doesn't mean you have to start preaching. But remember, the most powerful way to influence people is by example. And when you are circulating in these tiers of society and behaving in a way that represents Torah and mitzvahs and represents God, it allows you to show people, hey, you know what? Being extremely wealthy doesn't have to mean that you have to be materialistic. You can still be... Sorry?
Rabbi Udanasi, he was
there you go.
Very much into wealth and he admired wealth.
But he also compiled the Mishnah.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, yes, I'm just finishing the sentence for you in case not everybody understands where you're going.
But he did all these good things.
Right. So, there are many ways that money can be used for good things. Again, these are just a couple of examples. I guess those two examples are really similar ways, they're different specific manifestations, but money can be used for good things, right? So, a person who's going into business for a whole number of reasons and is not just going into business to be a shliach in the business world. Is going into business to make money. But this is a person whose entire life is aligned with godliness and with Torah and mitzvahs. And you can bet your bottom dollar that their financial net worth will be used out for many good things. This person's intention is not what most people would think. Most people think this person's intention is to have a big number, to have lots of money, to buy jets and cars and houses, etc., 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 and to be a hotshot. And really, this person's intent is to use money for good things, whatever it is, charity, all kinds of things. And there are so many examples that we could sit and talk about all day. So this person, and as long as any person who is a Torah mitzvahs Jew, not just behaviorally, but mentally, emotionally, psychologically, this is always their primary intent behind everything. And this is what Yaakov is telling us. Don't think, this is what the Torah is telling us, don't think that now because, okay, so back up, because I'm getting to the end before we do the whole middle. Yisroel, doing things in a way that's open and legit, means what you see is what you get. It's WYSIWYG. WYSIWYG is an acronym for what you see is what you get. Sorry. I learned that in high school in IT class in like 9th grade, I think, something like that. WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. It's Rashi Tevot for what you see is what you get.
What did you say? YZ?
WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. It's Rashi Tevot. So, right, and this means that, you know, and what this would represent in this scenario is someone who is aggressively pursuing lots of money, wants lots of money because they want lots of money. That's Yisroel. That's Surara, the Gilu Ponim. That's in a way that's legit and open. What you see is what you get. This guy's chasing the money because this guy wants the money. This guy is learning Torah and doing mitzvos because he wants to connect to God and bring God into the world. Those are two very different examples of WYSIWYG behavior, of Yisroel behavior. What you see is what you get. You're chasing the money because you want the money. You're doing the Torah mitzvahs because you want to bring God into the world. Then there's Yaakov, doing things in a way that what you see is not what you get. The actual intent is very different to the perceived intent. And the reality is that this is the majority of life for the majority of people. Most of us don't get to live a Yisroel life all day, every day. Most of us don't get to live a life where, assuming that our intent, and let's be realistic, assuming that we work on ensuring that our intent should be to whatever extent we can possibly get it to be. Our intent is God, godliness, dir b'tachtonim, uniting matter and spirit, bringing divinity into the world. If that is our intent, and it's what we at least want our intent to be, and we try to make that our primary intent, most of us don't get to live a life where that's what people who are observing us get to see all day, every day. Most of us don't get to just sit and learn Torah and do mitzvahs all day, every day. The reality is that the far, 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 far majority of Jewish people, of Torah Jews, of people whose intent is to connect to God and bring God into this world, don't get to live a life where that's what their intent seems to be all day, every day. Most of us have to get involved in worldly activities, worldly things, in business, in social media, in all kinds of things, in politics. Whatever it is, and again, there are so many examples, and we could sit and harp on all day about examples within all these many categories, and these are just a few of many categories. So most of us, and the proof is, you'll see, right? If we were to come back and have a reunion of this class in 10 years, we would see that all of us are going to be in very different places doing very different things. We don't all have to be people who just study Torah all day and do mitzvahs and don't do things that don't appear to be aligned with that intent. Most of us don't have, and even if we wanted to, most of us wouldn't have that privilege. Most of us wouldn't have that opportunity. And you know what? It's a good thing to want to have that opportunity. It's a good thing. It's very spiritually healthy to wish that we could, because that means that our intent is really in the right place. And we want the right things. Our ideals are on track. Our ideals are on target. But most of us in reality are not going to get to live that life. And this is the message that we are getting from this week's Parsha. most of us are going to have to engage with the world. Most of us are going to have to go into business, into politics, into whatever it is, into things that don't appear at the surface level to be Torah mitzvahs, to be spirituality oriented, to be godliness oriented. They don't appear to be like that. But that doesn't mean that our intent in business has to be about the business. It doesn't mean that if we are gifted in something to do with politics and based on a real self-aware assessment and an honest discussion with ourselves and with our mentors and those people, we decide that a career in something politically oriented is the way that we can best use out our gifts, and we go into that. That doesn't mean that our primary intent has to be about politics. We can go into career in something political, in something business, in something social media, in something promotional, marketing, sales, whatever it is, parenting, teaching. Right? And teaching doesn't have to mean teaching Torah. It could be, I know people in this community who are phenomenal, upstanding examples of Torah mitzvah Jews, and I know a number of them who are teachers in the New York public school system who are employed by the Board of Ed and teach secular studies to non-Jewish students, and they are outstanding examples of a Torah mitzvah Jew and of a Hasidic Jew. So what do? They're spending their time, and some of them are in schools that are kind of rough and tough, in schools where you have to go through metal detectors on the way into school in the morning. So you wouldn't think that this is a career that is Torah mitzvah oriented. You wouldn't think that their intent is godliness, that their intent is dir b'tachtonim. But it is. And this is the deceit. This is Yaakov. If your path in life takes you into a place where you have to engage in the world and do things that don't seem to be spirituality oriented, don't seem to be dir b'tachtonim oriented, don't seem to be godliness oriented, don't think that everything has to be what you see is what you get. Not everything has to be WYSIWYG. You can go into these environments and your intent can be for God. You can all the while... Now, just to clarify again, because this is important from a halachic perspective. It's not okay for me to get a job in sales and to sit there at my desk when I'm supposed to be making phone calls and thinking about Tanya or thinking about Gemara or Chumash. It's not okay for me to get a job in whatever it is and to spend my time learning Chumash instead of doing what I'm supposed to be doing. That's called stealing. What is okay is for me to go, when I am hired to do a job, I am halachically obligated to do that job 100%, at the very minimum, to the extent that's described in my job description. It's not okay to do other things instead. That's called stealing. What is okay is for my underlying intent to be to make the world divine, to bring God into the world. And that will play itself out. It may be very subtly in very different places. It'll also play itself out in the fact that when I wake up first thing in the morning, what's on my head is not my job and my business. What's on my head is Moda Ani Lefanecha, is God. When I go to sleep at night and I close my eyes and I'm waiting to fall asleep, the thing that's on my mind isn't my job and my business and my income. It's God. It's Shema Yisroel Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. And when I'm at work, it'll play itself out in the way that I walk, the way that I talk, the way that I interact with the people that I interact with. And it'll play itself out in the way that I use the resources that I generate through work. It'll play itself out in a whole myriad of different ways. The fact that I go and get a very aggressive income-oriented job, a job that's very aggressively income-oriented, if that's what I decide for the right reasons is the path that I should take, that doesn't mean that I have to say, face value, if this is the path that I'm taking, I have to be a person who is aggressively income-focused. No, it doesn't. I can take that path if that's the path that I decide for whatever reason, for the right reasons, hopefully is the right path for me to take. But I can be Yaakov. I can be deceitful. I can be running a scam. I can do all of that, honestly, in a way that is aligned with my job description. because otherwise it's stealing. But my underlying intent can still be for God. My underlying intent can still be to bring God into the world and to make the world divine. And that's why, see, again, Avram and Avraham represent two different things. And what Avram represented is obsolete. It's now Avraham phase. That's why we don't use the name Avram anymore. We've moved from Avram phase, departed that, and moved into Avraham phase. We haven't changed from Yaakov to Yisroel. We have added another operational mode. We have added another behavioral opportunity, and that is the Yisroel opportunity. From this point on, Yaakov became able to interact in a way and to affect the world, not only in a way that was deceitful, engaging with the world in a way that appears externally to be worldly oriented, but to really be doing it with a godly oriented intent, which is a form of deceit, became able to do both. And what this represents for most of us, again, we could divide people into the people whose life is generally a Yaakov, what we could refer to as a deceitful lifestyle, a lifestyle where we seem to be engaging with the world for worldly intent, but our actual intent is godly, versus the people who live a lifestyle of Yisroel, of Torah and mitzvahs explicitly all day, every day. But that's not so practical for us, because that's like most of us, those two things don't apply to most of us. Most of us don't get to experience both of those. So what's the lesson from this week's Parsha? That both of these names are still in use. Within our own lives, we have both. Right? We don't only engage in work, we also study Torah, we also daven, we also do mitzvahs. And then, for example, one example that's used that really makes this tangible is eating. Right? During the week we eat. Ideally, our intent for eating should be for health, for the nutrients, for the calories, for the macronutrients, the micronutrients, and all the things that we can get out of that. That should be our intent. But even when it is, our underlying intent is to get the micronutrients, the macronutrients, the calories, etc., so that we can be healthy and serve God, as opposed to someone else who's obsessing over the nutritional value of their food just as an end in itself. So when we pick up the packet and look at the calories, because we want to be healthy to be able to serve God as best we can, that is a form of deceit. Because most people who pick up the packet and look at the calories aren't thinking about God. They're thinking about either losing weight or gaining weight or whatever their objective is, depending on, what their goals are, or just on being healthy and having the right levels of all the different nutrients, whatever it is. If when I do that, I'm doing it because I want to be able to serve God as best as possible, my underlying intent is different to what it would appear to be. Eating on Shabbos is a mitzvah. You can eat on Shabbos with the intent to enjoy the food, and you are serving God because God says, I want you to enjoy good, tasty food on Shabbos. So the same act of eating during the week is Yaakov. On Shabbos, it's Yisroel. This is one example. But there are many, many examples of many different ways. And the message that this week's Parsha is telling us is, don't think that just because his name was upgraded from Yaakov, from doing things in a way that's deceitful with a deeper hidden intent, or not a hidden intent, but a not necessarily apparent intent, that became obsolete, and now we have to operate, and everyone has to live a Yisroel life, a life where all you do is learn Torah and do mitzvahs, where all you do all day is things that are very clearly godly oriented. It's okay. We can still use the name Yaakov. It's okay. It's a real part of life to engage with the world in a way that doesn't necessarily appear to be godly oriented. This name still applies.
People in Kollel don't think so. They think that they should be living in the Torah and mitzvot, and they don't work. They just deal with.
Well, to address that, I would say that, remember before, I said, first of all, there are some people whose life is primarily a Yaakov life and some people whose life is primarily a Yisroel life. I don't want to leave it at that because that doesn't give us full value. I want each of us to walk away from this class today knowing about the Yaakov in me and the Yisroel in me. How do both of these apply to me? What's the lesson that I can take away? Right? I want everyone to walk away with that. But there are, generally speaking, also the people whose life is primarily a Yaakov life. They also have a Yisroel element. We all daven, we all learn, etc., etc. Then there are the people whose lifestyle is primarily a Yisroel life, and you have to have both. Right? It is important to have people in a kollel, people whose emphasis is learning Torah all day. And the community needs that. The community needs the people who are the people who are learning Torah all day and are able to give guidance and leadership based on that study, which is why the community supports that. But generally speaking, that is a small subset of society, a small subset of the community.
Depends where you live.
That's true. That's true. But what I want us to walk away is that the Torah is speaking to us, and it's telling us just because Yaakov got the name Yisroel, the name Yaakov didn't go away. Don't think that you're only doing the right thing when you're living a Yisroel life, a life that is openly, readily, apparently Torah and mitzvahs and godly oriented. And that living a life and engaging with the world and doing worldly things that appear to be worldly oriented. Don't think that that is obsolete and that can't be part of your service to Hashem. The name Yaakov is still in effect. Having this non-apparent intent is still a part of what we're here to do. And the reality is that for the vast majority of us, that's the vast majority of our lives. These are the 6 days of the week as opposed to Shabbos. There's only one Shabbos and there are 6 days of the week. The majority of our lives, realistically for most of us, is going to be being involved in things that appear to be worldly. It's going to be work, it's going to be business, it's going to be teaching, it's going to be all kinds of mundane things. As long as our deepest intent in doing those things is to make the world divine and to bring God in the world, and that's our driving force, and it's reflected in the fact that we behave in accordance with Torah in all of those things, then we're on track. Because that's Yaakov. The name Yaakov didn't get scratched off the list. Because what Yaakov represents is still part of our lives, and realistically it's the majority of our lives. Don't think that if you're involved in worldly things, that means you're not serving God. You can be involved in worldly things. You can be involved in very worldly things to the extent that the fact that your intent is godly is a complete misrepresentation. What you're doing completely misrepresents the fact that your intent is godly, as long as it's in line with halacha. It just seems to be non-godly oriented, but if you know that you're doing that with a godly objective, if it's Yaakov, if it's deceitful, it's okay. The name Yaakov is still in effect. We can go through our lives and every part of our lives can be part of serving God. Every single component in our lives, as mundane as it seems to be, and as mundane as it actually is. If our intent is godly, and if the reason we're doing it is because it's part of our job here to live a Torah mitzvahs life and to make the world divine, then that is also Yaakov. It's not Yisroel, it's not done in a way that's legit. What you see is what you get, because it seems to be mundane, but it's still the same guy. It's still the person who the Jewish people are named after. It's still one of the ancestors of the entire Jewish people. It's still Yaakov. As long as we are allowed to do things that misrepresent our intent, as long as we're doing things that are honest and according to halacha, but we're allowed to do things that seem to be worldly, as long as the intent is right, as long as we're doing them for the right reasons and in the right ways. Don't think if you have to be involved in the world that that's history and that's not part of serving Hashem. Being involved in the world is Yaakov. And the Torah tells us the name Yaakov is still in effect. Hashem continues to call him Yaakov to let us know that we can continue to call him Yaakov, because Yaakov is a real part of life as a God-fearing and God-serving Torah mitzvahs Jew.